Welcome back to The Explainer. Today, we're talking about a massive, and I mean absolutely massive, paradigm shift in how we understand mental health. For decades, we've been handed this very neatly packaged story about why we feel persistent sadness. But the source material we're looking at today, it completely flips that narrative on its head. We're going to dive into a fascinating interview that challenges basically everything we thought we knew about depression. So let's just get right into it. To really wrap our heads around the scale of this, just consider this staggering statistic. According to the data in our source, right now, 8.7 million adults in England alone are taking antidepressants. 8.7 million? That works out to roughly 1 in 5 adults. Almost 20% of the adult population there is on this medication. It really goes to show just how deeply ingrained this whole topic is in our daily lives, which honestly makes the twist we're about to explore all the more shocking. And here is that twist. Dr. Joanna Moncrieff, a leading psychiatrist, drops an absolute bombshell in this source material. She says, and I quote, "There is no evidence that you have a chemical imbalance in your brain if you are depressed." I mean, wow, that creates some instant narrative tension, right? Today, we are neutrally exploring her comprehensive findings and looking at the exact evidence she brought forward to challenge a medical consensus that has dominated our culture for decades. So let's start with part 1, the chemical imbalance myth itself. For this part, I'm going to ask you to temporarily set aside literally everything you've been taught about having a broken brain. Despite this widespread public belief that depression is directly caused by a lack of serotonin, Dr. Moncrieff actually led a massive umbrella review in 2022 to put that exact science to the test. Her team gathered and analyzed thousands, yes, thousands of studies across all these different areas of research. And their conclusion was groundbreaking. They found absolutely no consistent evidence linking serotonin levels to depression. Put simply, they found zero solid proof of an underlying biological or chemical abnormality that causes the condition. When you actually break down the data from that huge review, the results are just completely mixed. They're all over the board. Like, sure, some studies did find serotonin was a bit lower in depressed people, but then others found absolutely no difference whatsoever. And incredibly, some studies actually found serotonin was higher in people with depression. So the overall consensus here is pretty clear. There is no consistent biological marker for clinical depression. Which brings us to our second point, the 1990s pharma boom. This naturally raises a massive question, right? If the fundamental science isn't there, why is this theory so universally accepted by doctors and patients everywhere? Well, to understand that, we have to look at how the idea evolved over time. Back in the 1960s, a few psychiatrists first proposed the chemical imbalance theory, but it was kind of just a fringe idea. It wasn't really accepted by the general public. Fast forward to the 1990s, and the pharmaceutical industry grabbed this concept and just ran with it. They launched these massive, highly funded promotional campaigns to sell a brand new class of drugs called SSRIs. And it wasn't until 2022 that the comprehensive review we just talked about systematically debunked it. So it literally transformed from a fringe 60s theory into a massive 1990s marketing juggernaut. And the source points out a very specific marketing pivot that made this all possible. Before the 90s, people were largely prescribed benzodiazepines for emotional problems, but those drugs had developed a notoriously terrible reputation for causing severe dependency. By pushing the serotonin deficiency narrative instead, the industry could basically reframe depression as a distinct medical brain disorder, and that clever framing allowed companies to distance their new SSRIs from those older, highly stigmatized anxiety meds. They could market them as a safe, strictly medical fix for a biological disease. Okay, moving into part 3. How do antidepressants actually work? So what are these pills actually doing if they aren't fixing a broken brain? We hear the term SSRI all the time, right? It stands for Selective Serotonin Reuptake Inhibitor. By definition, these are drugs designed to inhibit the transporter protein that removes serotonin from the gaps between your nerve cells. Supposedly, this keeps more of it active in the brain. But our source points out something really fascinating. While the theory claims they permanently enhance serotonin activity, some long-term evidence paradoxically suggests that being on these drugs for extended periods might actually lower your serotonin activity over time. And this brilliantly illustrates two very contrasting models of how we view medication. First, we have the disease-centered model. This is what we've all been sold, the idea that drugs target and fix an underlying biological abnormality. But Dr. Moncrieff argues for the drug-centered model instead. This alternative model suggests that drugs simply enter the brain to artificially alter our normal chemistry, creating a temporary emotional numbing effect. It's kind of like how drinking alcohol temporarily alters your emotional state, you know? Which brings us to a really striking data point that the source calls the efficacy gap. If these drugs are just artificially altering our state, how well do they actually treat depression? Well, in clinical trials comparing antidepressants to inactive placebos, the antidepressants only score about 2 points better on a standard 52-point depression scale. Just 2 points. The source highlights that this slight emotional numbing effect barely outperforms a dummy pill, which obviously raises some serious questions about their overall long-term benefit. Now, let's turn to part 4 and talk about side effects and withdrawal. When we look at the physical realities of these medications, we really need to keep in mind the very real struggles that patients face every single day. The explainer source objectively lists several severe reported consequences of altering brain chemistry over long periods. These include emotional numbing, where patients literally report an inability to cry or feel joy, saying life just feels universally flat. There's also a high rate of persistent sexual dysfunction, which shockingly, the source notes, can sometimes persist long after the drug is completely stopped. And finally, there's severe withdrawal symptoms. Because of those severe withdrawal symptoms, it is absolutely vital we talk about safe tapering. The source issues a very strict, highly cautious warning here. Patients should never, ever abruptly stop their medication. You must not quit cold turkey. Instead, you need to reduce the dose incredibly slowly. It's highly recommended to consult detailed clinical guides like the Maudsley Prescribing Guidelines, and patients should expect emotional withdrawal symptoms like anxiety and tearfulness as their brain desperately tries to adjust. So the crucial takeaway here is that coming off these medications too fast triggers persistent withdrawal. This can manifest as prolonged states of anxiety, intense dizziness, extreme fatigue, and feeling these bizarre sensations of electricity or brain zaps. And because this withdrawal can last for months or even years, it closely mimics a depressive relapse. This often causes doctors to incorrectly conclude that the underlying disease has returned, leading them to prescribe the drugs for life, when in reality, the patient is actually just experiencing severe withdrawal. This takes us to part 5, redefining depression. If we move away from the chemical model, what are we actually left with? Let's explore Dr. Moncrieff's alternative, highly humanized definition of depression discussed in the source. She argues that depression is not a biological disease, in the way that, say, lung cancer is a biological disease. Instead, it's a profound, fully understandable emotional reaction to personal life events and circumstances, things like job loss, trauma, or intense relationship stress. Now, clarifying this doesn't mean depression isn't real or painful, right? It simply recategorizes it as an emotional state that requires individual, situational help rather than just a uniform, one-size-fits-all pill. To really illustrate this, the source shares an anecdote about a study analyzing depression blogs. Researchers found that believing you have a broken brain actually limits a patient's agency. It makes them feel like passive victims of their biology. But when they looked at people who had recovered, they found a common thread. As one patient put it, they all said that they had to take active steps themselves in order to change their lives, to overcome this problem. Regaining that personal agency and taking active lifestyle steps ultimately led to their personal growth and recovery. All right, let's look at our final section. Part 6, the new drug frontier. How does all of this build into the future of pharmaceutical treatments for mental distress? Well, as the patents for older SSRIs expire and profits begin to dry up, the pharmaceutical industry is pivoting once again. The source outlines a new wave of emerging treatments gaining immense popularity. We are seeing a massive surge in adult ADHD medications, the rise of esketamine clinics, which, by the way, is a very close relative to the club drug ketamine, and serious clinical trials for psychedelics like psilocybin and ecstasy. What is really striking here is that these new medical treatments bear an incredible resemblance to highly potent recreational drugs. And the source highlights a major concern with this new frontier, looking at it as a dangerous quick fix. These new treatments often prioritize temporary dissociation or rapid mood alteration over actually resolving the underlying life issues causing the distress in the first place. By utilizing esketamine infusions or psychedelics, the source worries we might just be finding a brand new way to temporarily numb patients, all while risking the creation of dangerous long-term dependencies on these clinical drugs. And this brings us to a critical realization. As we wrap up this explainer, we are left with a really provocative question. If there is no magic pill for human distress, are we ready to do the hard work of building more meaningful lives? It asks us to totally rethink our entire societal approach to mental health, to move away from looking for a quick chemical fix and to instead empower personal agency, connection, and purpose. Thanks so much for joining me today, and I really hope this provided a structured, illuminating perspective on the science of mental health. Catch you next time.